This is Module 0, which is focusing on section P.1, and we're going to work through the first 3 examples in the lecture guide. This is your first video in this course. Please note, most lecture guides will start with learning outcomes, including vocabulary and notation, and also a list of things that you should be expected to understand by the time you're done with your learning and reading and videos and homework. So in this first lecture guide, you'll notice a few basic vocabulary words: observational units, variables, quantitative and categorical variable. So this is a statistics course. The big idea here is that we have some research question that we want to ask out in the world. It may be a research question about a population of people. It may be a research question about something like a coin even. Like, is my coin fair? If I flip it and flip it and flip it forever and ever, does it actually flip heads 50% of the time? It might be a research question about a thing, like what percentage of Skittles are red? So you have a research question you want to ask, and you're going to go out in the world and you're going to take a sample, and then you are going to write down some information about that sample, and you're going to perform some statistical analysis and try to come to a conclusion about the general population. And the entire semester, we're going to talk about all of that and try to figure out how to go about doing that well. So first here, observational units. The observational units is just what it sounds like. It's the thing you're observing. It might be people. It might be like bags of Skittles. It might be a coin that you're flipping. It is just the individual entity on which data is being recorded. A variable then is the actual thing you're recording about that observational unit. It's the characteristic that you're recording about the observational unit. So for example, I observe flips of a coin, that's the observational unit, and I record whether I get heads or tails, which is the variable. Another example, I observe students at DCC, which is the observational unit, and I record about them whether they like chocolate or vanilla or strawberry ice cream most. So that would be the variable. Again, observational unit is the thing you're observing, and the variable is what you are recording about that observational unit. So a quantitative variable would indicate that you're writing down numbers about that observational unit, and a categorical variable is one that is just categories. So let's just do some examples and try to sort through what's going on with these vocabulary words. So example 1 comes right from your textbook, section P.1. It says, Johnson and Goldstein recruited 161 participants for a study. This was published in the journal Science to address the question of organ donor recruitment. The participants were asked to imagine that they had moved to a new state and were applying for a driver's license. As part of this application, the participants were to decide whether or not to become an organ donor. Participants were presented with one of 3 different default choices. I'm going to go ahead and call these choices 1, 2, and 3. So choice 1, some of the participants were forced to make a choice of becoming a donor or not, without any sort of default option. They just said, you have to make a choice. Do you want to become a donor or do you not want to become a donor? Choose. So option 2 then, other participants were told that the default was to not be a donor, but they could opt in if they wanted to. And then the third group was told that they were defaulted to be a donor and that they could, if they wanted to, opt out. So what is the research question that they're trying to answer there? So when you're identifying a research question, you're thinking like big picture. What is the question we're trying to figure out here? Like if they published this in the journal Science, what might have been the opening sentence? What might have been the title of that research paper? It seems to me what they're trying to figure out here is which one of these 3 methods would produce more organ donation. Would having a state, for example, use option number 3, create more organ donors in their state? All right, so what I wrote here for my solution, which method creates more organ donors? Or maybe you would say, does one of the 3 methods produce more organ donation participation? Something to that effect. So part B, describe the observational units, the variables, and also whether those variables are quantitative or categorical. So let's start with observational units. The observational units, the things you're observing, the things you're writing information down about. So the observational units, my tip to you, when you start to describe observational units, my tip to you is to see if they told you how big the sample size was. And in this case, they did. They said the sample size was 161. They talked to 161 people. The observational units, generally, you can start your description of them with the sample size. In this case, the observational units are the 161 participants in this study. And in general, you can start your description of an observational units like that. The 50 times we flipped the coin, the 120 people we talked to, the 25 bags of Skittles, the things that you're talking to. But you can usually start that out with the actual sample size. It's often given in the information. So what is the variable? A variable is the characteristics, the things you're writing down about your observational units. So imagine walking up to any of these observational units, walking up to any of these participants in the study. What do you write down on your clipboard about those participants? And in this case, there actually are two variables. Think about that. When you are standing in front of one of the participants with your clipboard, you would write down two pieces of information. The first piece of information you would write down about one of the participants is which of the three groups they were in. That is the neutral group, the opt-in group, or the opt-out group. And that, of course, then would be categorical variable because it's not a number you're writing down. You're writing in neutral group or opt-in group or opt-out group. Which category does this person fall in? Which category? So it's a categorical variable. Each participant would have their own category they fall in. The second variable you would write down about each participant is whether or not that person ended up being an organ donor. So again, all these participants are in different groups, but they each ultimately have the choice. Do you want to be the organ donor or not be the organ donor? So you want to write down which group were they put in and whether or not they ended up being an organ donor or not. Again, this is a categorical variable. They're either an organ donor at the end or they're not an organ donor at the end. Which category do they fall in? Part C then is really a question for you. Which results do you think that they would find with this study? Do you think that one of these groups would have a higher participation rate in being an organ donor? I personally think that the third group is likely to have a higher participation rate than the other two groups. That's just my personal opinion on it, though. I think that because it seems to me, in general, if you opt people into something and they have to actually, work or do something to opt out of it, many of them will just likely stay in it. So if you opt people into being organ donors, I think a lot of people would just be like, yeah, sure, I'll stay an organ donor. Whereas to opt out of it, you actually have to be a person that would say, yeah, no, I want you to take me out of that. And there's probably less people doing that than there would be in the other two groups. All right, let's try example 2. Example 2, again, is from section P.1. It's an exercise. It says a famous study titled The Effect of Deliberative Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance, published in Psychological Review, led to the now conventional wisdom that 10,000 hours of deliberative practice are necessary to achieve expert performance in skills such as music and sports. The researchers in this study asked violin students at the Music Academy of West Berlin to keep a diary indicating how they spent their time. The researchers also asked the students' professors to indicate which were the top students with the potential for careers as international soloists, which were good violinists but not among the best, and which were studying to become music teachers. Researchers found that those in the top two groups, the soloist types and the good but not the best types, devoted much more time per week to individual practice than did those in the group studying to become music teachers. All right, again, observational units here. Again, the thing we're observing. The observational units in this are the violin students. They didn't tell us how many this time, unfortunately. Next, identify the quantitative variable. So when you walk up to each violin student, what do we write down about that violin student that's a number? We would be writing down the number of hours the student spent per week on practice. That's the quantitative variable, the number we'd write down about the student. What we would write down that's a categorical variable is the information we got about the student from the professor. We got information from the professor that the professor ranked the student either as like the top, international soloist type, or a good but not the best type, or a studying to be a music teacher type. Those are categories, so for each of those students, you'd be ranking the student with a quantitative number, how many hours per week spent on practice, and also a category, whether they're in which of the three groups the professor puts them in. Example 3. Again, from your textbook on tattoos, this problem. Consider the students in your class as observational units in a statistical study about tattoos. Indicate whether it's a categorical variable or a quantitative variable or a research question. So how many tattoos the student has. So notice this question, to answer it, you would walk up to each observational unit and you would write down number of tattoos. You'd walk up to an observational unit and write something down. That must be a variable. So in this case, since the variable would be how many, it would be a number, it is a quantitative variable. Whether male students are more likely to have a tattoo than female students. Now notice, this is not a variable. You couldn't walk up to one observational unit. You couldn't walk up to one student and answer this question. I couldn't walk up to Bob Jones in the class and answer whether male students are more likely to have a tattoo than female students. In order to answer this question, I would actually have to do a statistical study. I would have to go out and talk to lots of male students and talk to lots of female students and write down whether they're male or female and how many tattoos they have and perform an analysis. I can't just answer that by talking to an observational unit. So this is a research question. To answer that question, you'd have to conduct a study, whether or not the student has a tattoo. So I could walk up to any one of the students and write down, do you have a tattoo or do you not have a tattoo? So that is definitely a variable. You walk up to an observational unit, you write this down, whether they have a tattoo or not. And it's a categorical variable because it's a category. Have a tattoo, not have a tattoo. Next, what subject the student is majoring in. So again, you could walk up to a student and write down, what's your major? And that means it's a categorical variable. You could answer that question for each of the observational units. Lastly, whether students majoring in liberal arts tend to have more tattoos than students majoring in engineering. This is a research question. I know it's a research question because the only way to answer this is by talking to many, many students and getting lots of information and performing a statistical analysis. So I'd need to talk to lots of students and find out, which of you are liberal arts and not liberal arts, how many tattoos do each of you have, and compare how many tattoos the liberal arts students have in general in comparison to those in engineering. And it would take a lot of time and a lot of people to talk to. So that is a research question.